We're going to run through all the options the Broncos have at their disposal for trying to replace Tim Patrick. But if he comes across this video, which I'm sure he's going to be looking to see what people are saying about him, let's let him know that Broncos country doesn't just have his back, but we are 100% behind him and rallying around him and encouraging his recovery. And I want to break the channel record. 810 likes on a video for 81 for Tim Patrick. So let's get 810 likes for number 81. Welcome into the Broncos Breakdown and what is unfortunately becoming an annual tradition. Tim Patrick replacements. Sucks dick. No other way around it. It blows. But it is the nature of the beast. It is the NFL. Players get hurt. The league does not stop. It is next man up. And so we are going to run through some options Denver, George, and Sean Payton have to try and replace their number, 1, 2, or 3 wide receiver, depending on who you ask. Let's be honest. But the first option for replacing Tim Patrick is, before we even look outwards, before we even look at free agency or anything like that, what about in-house, right? What do you have in your own backyard right now? When we look at Denver's wide receiver room, they have a pretty deep wide receiver class. Kendall Hinton, Marquez Callaway, Montrell Washington, Michael Bandy, Lil Jordan Humphrey. I mean, all of those players on screen, except for Nick Williams, have NFL regular season experience. That's not true for a lot of wide receiver rooms. There are a lot of wide receiver rooms that at the bottom, it's a bunch of UDFAs that have never even made a practice squad. That is not the case for Denver. They have a very deep wide receiver room. When I think about the first options to replace Tim Patrick in-house, Marvin Mims definitely comes to mind because he was their top draft pick. They moved up into round 2 to get the Oklahoma Sooner, who can stretch the field. Marquez Callaway, Kendall Hinton, Jalen Virgil, and Brandon Johnson, those last 3 guys, all flirted with the practice squad and the active 53-man roster a season ago. Marquez Callaway came over in free agency with Sean Payton. He had some good time in New Orleans, so he could be in for a bigger workload this upcoming season as he moves up the depth chart. But the obvious name is Marvin Mims, right? Because last year with Oklahoma, over 1,000 yards. He led the FBS in receiving average for qualifying players at 20.1 yards per reception, which is just wild to actually sit down and think about. 6 touchdowns. So Marvin Mims would be the clear and obvious in-house candidate to replace Tim Patrick. If you want to go to one of those other guys we just looked at, Marquez Callaway has the most experience of the bunch, over 1,000 career yards, 7 touchdowns. But Kendall Hinton, an all-time Broncos quarterback legend. Jalen Virgil and Brandon Johnson also had some really good moments last year. Both guys had touchdowns in the regular season after being promoted from the practice squad. But I know everyone is going to be quick to go to 83 to replace 81. And I think that's going to happen. But I do want to remind you that Marvin Mims and Tim Patrick are very different types of wide receivers, right? Marvin Mims averaged 20.1 yards per reception at Oklahoma his last year. Tim Patrick is not a player that when he steps on the field, the safeties take a step back because he's got that deep threat burning ability. They are very different types of receivers. They have very different skill sets. And Tim Patrick's got that big-bodied frame that makes it a nightmare in the red zone trying to box out against, like he's down in the low post. Marvin Mims, he ain't boxing out anyone in the red zone. But I think Marvin Mims would be the first guy to see an increased workload in snaps, get on the field more, get more targets and all that, now that Tim Patrick, unfortunately, has been lost for the season. Now, let's say Denver wants to go external, right? After a couple of weeks in training camp and preseason, they're like, hey, we saw last year how it went in this offense without Tim Patrick and not really going external to replace him. And for whatever reason, they decide we don't want to go down that path again. There are some very notable free agent wide receivers, starting things off with Mr. Julio Jones, a future NFL Hall of Famer that we all know has not been that prime Julio from Atlanta for the last few seasons. In fact, he has not played a full season since 2018. He's been limited to 58% of games in the past 3 seasons. His last year in Atlanta, his only year in Tennessee, and last year in Tampa Bay. In fact, last year with the Bucs, it was a career low in receiving yards and receptions. But Julio Jones is Julio Jones. Like, I don't have to sell you on Julio Jones. What I have to sell you on, and I'm not really even trying to sell you on, is if you look at his stats over the last 4 years, if there is even just a drop of belief in the Peyton brass that 2019 Julio Jones is somehow still inside that version of the 2022 guy, they'll go out and get Julio Jones. But if they believe that he is what he has looked like over the last 3 years, and that 2019 guy is long gone at this point, then they're not going to give it a second thought. Ultimately, you really want to replace an injured Tim Patrick with a frequently injured player in Julio Jones. I think you're just signing yourself up for a headache and a lot of Advil being taken if you sign a player who then immediately gets injured and misses some time, because that's what he's done over the last 3 seasons. I'm not banking on that 2019 Julio Jones walking through the door and saving this team's season. Those days are over. Next guy we're going to look at is Jarvis Landry. Now, he's not quite as old as Julio Jones. 30 years old, last year with the New Orleans Saints after a long time in Cleveland, Ohio. And you can see in 2022, he was limited to just 9 games, 272 yards, 1 touchdown. Before that in Cleveland, you can see the, unfortunate downfall for Jarvis or Juice. 1,100 yards, 800 yards, and then 500 yards, and now 272 yards. So if you want to add Jarvis Landry to add some leadership to this locker room, sure, I can get behind that. But does this team need a leader wide receiver? No, they've got plenty of veteran players in Courtland Sutton and Russell Wilson, right? This is not a young quarterback who needs a veteran receiver to help him along. So I would pass on Jarvis Landry. If you had to pick a wide receiver, who would you pick? Julio Jones or Jarvis Landry? Type their most notable number down in the comments section below. For me, between these two guys, I'd probably go with Julio because his ceiling's higher. And if you are able to capture that 2019 version, that's better than any version Jarvis Landry has ever been. But Landry is at least probably a little bit more healthy and younger and maybe has some more juice left in the tank. So you can make good arguments for both players. Third guy we're going to look at is Kenny Golladay. Northern Illinois legend, 29, so the youngest of the 3 we have looked at so far. And Kenny Golladay is an interesting nut to crack because he was at one point the fall of free agency, signed a 4-year, $72 million contract with the New York Giants. New York ultimately released him after 2 years of that 4-year contract, but it's not too long ago. He led the NFL in receiving touchdowns, which at this point might just be a random trivia fact in 10 years, when he had 11 back in 2019. Now, reportedly, he had some attitude issues in New York. I can't say for certainty because I was not in New York, but the buzz coming out of the Meadowlands was that he wasn't very happy with the targets he was getting, and instead of having a lunch pail work attitude or ethic to it and coming in and putting in the extra man hours to prove everyone he deserves more playing time, he decided to go the other way, which is pout on the sidelines and not run very hard and get hurt sort of and just want to sit out and take his $40 million guaranteed. When you look at Kenny Galladay's numbers, once again, we find ourselves in a very similar spot where we go, if you can find that 2019 version, sure, that's a great player to go out and sign. I don't think that 2019 version is walking through the door anytime soon. But if they believe that they can fix his attitude issues and that he's not bad anymore, but it's just it didn't work out in New York and the coaching staff wasn't great. I mean, they did fire Joe Judge, so he might have something to say about it not being 100% just his fault. Maybe Denver does take a flyer on Kenny Golladay and goes, hey, we're finding the NFL touchdown receiving leader from a few seasons ago who, didn't work out in New York, and he's partially to blame for it, but he was also in a horrible situation with, in my opinion, a bad quarterback in Daniel Jones and a bad coaching staff in those first few seasons with Joe Judge. So that's one name to keep an eye on for sure. The last 2 guys, former first-round pick N'Keal Harry, and then Rashard Higgins as well, a notable name for some of you back at home. 2 guys that definitely could be on the move in the next couple of weeks as teams definitely look to fill out their rosters. We'll throw on their career stats for you guys to see. N'Keal Harry, a first-round pick out of Arizona State for the New England Patriots, did not work out there, traded to Chicago, only with the Bears for one season. Whereas Rashard Higgins, kind of a long-time Cleveland Brown, was with the Panthers last I saw, but really didn't play any football in Carolina. Higgins has more experience, so if Denver doesn't want to go the big savvy name free agency route, but more of a lower-level name who's got, a little bit more of a pep in his step and ready to come in and try and prove he still has a spot in the NFL, these could be two guys to keep an eye on. But sound off for me down in the comment section below. Who do you want the Broncos to sign? Of those 5 players, if you had to pick one, who would it be? I'm probably in between Kenny Golladay and Rashard Higgins. I don't know what Higgins has left in the tank, but he had some good years for the Browns. And again, you're not finding a guy at this point who's going to walk through and save the season. But Kenny Golladay, if he can get his attitude checked, I just loved him so much in Detroit. I thought he was such a good player. I always wanted it to work out for him in New York. But maybe with an actual coach like Sean Payton, he can kind of get his head on straight and he can be a productive player for Denver. And also be the type of receiver that Tim Patrick is, which is a big-bodied red zone target. Before we get on to option number 3 to replace Tim Patrick, make sure you check out the 2023 Broncos sideline hats. They are on sale right now, chatsports.com/Broncos hat. That link is in the comments and the description of today's video, too. If you're a fan of this year's sideline hats and merchandise and whatnot, apparel, make sure you check out our link and then pick up your very own Broncos hat. Third option for replacing Tim Patrick is via trade. Now, this one would be the most desperate of the 3, if you will, because it requires some assets going out the door as opposed to just promoting from within or signing someone to free agency. This would require some picks or some players going the other way to get someone. Now, who could they trade for? There are some receivers that I think could be on the move sometime between now and training camp ending or preseason ending and week 1 kicking off. Cedrick Wilson is kind of getting boxed out in Miami. They've got Tyreek Hill. They have Jalen Waddle. There's not really a home for Cedrick Wilson all of a sudden. Tre'Quan Smith we'll look at in a moment. He's an interesting name for sure. Quez Watkins in the Eagles organization has kind of fallen down the depth chart a little bit. Corey Davis with the Jets has definitely fallen down the depth chart. I don't see how he's on New York's roster week 1 when they've got Allen Lazard, Randall Cobb, Garrett Wilson. They've got a lot of guys there in New York. And then I tossed on Hunter Renfrow for shits and giggles, more just to make Raiders fans upset that they're going to trade away one of their few good players. But Tre'Quan Smith is an interesting name because he does have some overlap with Sean Payton. In fact, when he played with Sean Payton in New Orleans, 1,400 yards, 17 touchdowns in 15 games. Those aren't maybe eye-popping numbers. The 17 touchdowns is definitely not small, but you're not finding a wide receiver 1 or 2. You're looking for a wide receiver 3. And that could be Tre'Quan Smith. And if we have learned one thing, everyone, this offseason, what is it? Bueller? Sean Payton loves reunions. Sean Payton just wants to bring the whole band up to Denver. So would not be blown away if he makes a second trade, by the way, with his former team after bringing over tight end Adam Trautman during the draft. At the end of the day, do not expect a notable name to be traded to Denver. I just don't think they're going to have that big of an urgency to replace Tim Patrick with a high-caliber name that requires some premium assets going the other way. You might see them trade for someone towards roster cutdown day if George Payton's talking to another GM and he's saying, I'm going to cut this guy, and he goes, well, I don't want to risk not getting him on the waiver wire. Let me trade you a future 7th-round pick. That could be something that happens ultimately. To wrap up the show, today's high in Denver as we film this on Tuesday during our live show is 84 degrees, and that gets us a nice warm plate take. Our warm plate take today is this is the last season that Jerry Jeudy, Courtland Sutton, and Tim Patrick are all on the Denver Broncos roster. I'm sorry, sucks to say out loud, but that's just the reality of what is likely going to happen here, which is Courtland Sutton is playing for his future in Denver this season. Jerry Jeudy's got this year and next year under contract, but I don't know what to make of Tim Patrick and his future just in football, period. And if he is able to come back and play, I'm not quite sure they'll be able to pay Sutton, Jeudy, and Patrick for another season. So Ultimately, I think we're only going to see 11 total games where these three guys were all on the field at the same time.